The following program contains archived content. Some of the information may now be out of date.
Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, welcome along, Shirley-Anne,
Thanks.
to our very first Citizens of Toowoomba or Humans of Toowoomba chat. So I wanted to interview you today because you're such a fascinating person. I've heard you speak on a number of occasions. So I'm just going to start off asking you about your childhood in New Zealand, because you can tell that you've got a very strong
I just had to say
New
hello.
That's right. We're having some chops.
Yeah.
I won't do the bad accent. But tell me about growing up in New Zealand and tell me about how you come to Toowoomba.
I grew up in a really small town in New Zealand. For the first 8 years of my life, my family travelled around a lot. My father was an apprentice electrician, and so we went where the job took him because my parents were teenagers, and my mum had my sister when she was 16 and me when she was 17. So it was quite tough. I don't really remember the first 8 years of my life that well until we moved to a place called Feilding. And Feilding's got a population of about 15,000 people. And that's where I went to high school and stayed there until I was 18, and then I moved 17 kilometres away to a larger city called Palmerston North, which is where I ended up settling and meeting my husband.
Wow.
And my childhood, I didn't know really what I wanted to do with my life, and so I never really had any idea. With my parents being teenagers, I didn't really have any role models, which is why when people see me now, they'll see I like a lot of quotes, and I often quote people, famous people, because for me they were the role models of who they would say things, or I'd read something and I'd think, gee, that's who I want to be when I'm older. So when I was about 16, I found the poet Rudyard Kipling, and I read his poem If, and If became the Bible of my life, and I still love that poem today.
So tell me some of the lines that you love from that poem.
The very end of it is something, and I read it out at my sister's wedding actually when she got married, and it's, if you can fill each unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and all that's in it. And I just love that, but it starts with, if you can keep your head about you and all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. And so in every job I've had people do that.
Can you remember how you got exposed to Rudyard Kipling?
No, I don't. I just stumbled across it one day, and then I realised, gosh, I like that one. And then over my career, various jobs, I've found other ones like Theodore Roosevelt's The Critic. So If by Rudyard Kipling and The Critic by Theodore Roosevelt are two of my all-time favourites. And The Critic is about being the man in the arena, and it talks about how you're better to be covered in blood and sweat and fail than to live in the grey that knows neither victory nor defeat. And
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah, so don't sit by and watch it as life goes by. Get in there and have a go.
Yeah, and don't criticise others that do, because actually it's better to do that and actually be the one doing than the one sitting down.
Sure. So I'm just going to stay on your childhood for a little bit.
Yeah,
so
sure.
You and your sister then settled, and you went to high school, and your
Yes.
mum and dad, did they stay together in the end?
Yes, they've stayed together.
Oh, wow.
Yes,
True.
and when I talk about the social determinants of health, because that became an interest of mine, because my grandparents split up when I was very young on my dad's side of the family. They were Dutch immigrants, and my dad associated with his mother, and my dad's sister associated with my grandfather, and so they had a very different, they didn't really talk to each other. But my grandmother was lovely, but she had a lot of chronic conditions, and 3 out of the 4 of my grandparents died in their very early 50s because of chronic disease. And that's when I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, because my mum had dropped out of school. She was for education, but when you don't know what you don't know, I was the first one in my family to go to university. And at first I wanted to be a millionaire. And so, because I didn't have money, I really wanted it. And so I started studying finance. And I got my finance degree. And then I realised, I don't know, there's more to life. And I did a couple of papers in social anthropology and I realised, oh my gosh, that's really what I'm interested in, people and cultures and how people become who they are and how society can turn someone into something that, so you are where you grow up. And I could it really resonated with me that most people born in poverty remain there. So I studied social anthropology and that has always then become my passion. And then when I finished university...
The second time?
When I finished my social anthropology, during that time, my mum has always worked with people with an intellectual disability because her brother has an intellectual disability, and I really admire my mum because she actually devotes her whole life to that, and she works tirelessly for people with intellectual disabilities. So when I was at university, I got a job looking after 6 older people with an intellectual disability, and that's where I met my husband Dan, because he worked with young people with an intellectual disability, and we went to an intellectually handicapped disco one day when I was about 20, and I think I was about 20, and he rocked on up with this wheelchair, and I thought, wow, look at this guy, and it was love at first sight for me. And and so then I got talking to him and his parents, and he grew up in Palmerston North where I'd moved to go to uni, and then we clicked. And then he had said that he had gone on a trip to Japan and loved it. And I happened to walk around the university as I was finishing up and saw a sign that said, do you want to go to Japan? You don't have to speak the language, just have a passion for cultures. And that was me. And I thought, yay. And so I applied to go on a thing called the JET program, a Japanese English and Teaching program. And they accepted me. And they said on the application form, where do you want to go in Japan? And I thought I'll pick the top, middle or bottom because I didn't know anything about Japan at all. And they put me dead smack in the middle in a place called Kaizucho, which was surrounded by rice fields. And so Dan and I went over and spent 3 years there, and that's where our daughter Jasmine was born, and 18 months into our trip there.
So what were you doing? You were teaching English at that stage?
I was teaching English at a high school over there, and Dan, so when I'd met Dan, he then started he loved little kids, so he went when we went to Japan and he taught little kids and I taught high school.
Right.
And even though I loved social anthropology, I didn't know how to make that into a job. And so I spent the 3 years teaching English, and then we realised we wanted our kids, or at the time our daughter Jasmine, to grow up and know her grandparents, because being away was hard. So we decided to move back to Palmerston North, and the good thing about our hometown is it has a Japanese university there. And so I had emailed them and said, can I get a job? And I got a job lecturing in English. And so I spent a year doing that, but then I realised I don't really like teaching. It's not really my passion. And my dad had been an apprentice electrician when I was little, and then became an electrician. And he had, from a very young age, when we'd moved to Fielding, so I was about 8, he got a job in the health system in the building and maintenance department of our Palmerston North Hospital, and he'd been there ever since, so years and years and years. So after a year of English teaching, I said to him, what should I do? What career do I do now? And he said, get a job in health, you'll always have a job. And so I got a job there as a health statistician. And I loved doing the stats.
What sort of thing does that involve? What do you do with a health statistician?
A doctor would come and say things like, we're doing respiratory clinics and we want to know how many people are under 30 and what conditions they come for. And what I realised in doing stuff like that is people don't know what they don't know. So the doctors would say that, and I'd say, well, actually, I think what you want to know is how many have come this year compared to last year. So I'd do really big reports, and it was so much fun because I love learning. And so then I got a bit of a reputation as being the person to go to. And then the finance department there asked me for a job. And so then I moved over to the finance department, and then they said, we need to report to the Ministry of Health, which is New Zealand's equivalent to the Department of Health, on our performance. And I super love highlighting how well we're doing on things. I'm a real optimist. And so I would write reports on how great we were. And then I got known as the person to go to for doing that. And then I became the manager of planning and accountability. And then I got shoulder tapped to be operations manager of the hospital. So that was pretty much very similar, even though I'm Executive Director of Toowoomba Hospital now, Operations Manager of Palmerston North Hospital was really similar. And it would be about finding new ways of doing things and models of care.
Right.
And so I did that, and then I became Director of Projects and leading that. And that took me to Australia because I led a project which was implementing a thing called Map of Medicine in the North Island. It was supposed to be just in Palmerston North, but everywhere wanted it, and I went and travelled around the North Island implementing that. And so an organisation in Brisbane asked me to come and present to them. So I flew over to Brisbane and thought, what am I doing in New Zealand? The weather in Australia is amazing.
So that's how you came to Australia.
And
so
that's
at
how
that time, how old was your daughter? You still had a young daughter?
You
had any other children at that stage?
Yes, so during that time of working in health, I ended up having another 2 children. So when Jasmine was almost 4, the day before her 4th birthday, Charlotte was born, or we call her Charlie. And then 2 years after that, Blake was born. So we came to Australia in 2013, and Jasmine was starting high school. And then Charlie and Blake were in primary school. So now they're 14 and 16.
Okay. So Shirley-Anne, you came to Australia, you had 3 young kids, a young family, and your career was starting to take off. So how did you manage that? How did you find, as a executive woman, your career's going crazy? How did you manage your home life? And tell me about coping with that.
Well, I'm incredibly lucky because when I met Dan at the Intellectually Handicapped Disco, we fell for each other straight away and got married, got engaged a year later, and he had said he wanted children, and I said, no, I do not want any children, because for me, growing up, I didn't want my children to... I just didn't want children at that time. I didn't feel I needed them in my life. And Dan said, I'll only marry you if you think about children when you're 35. And the reason we ended up with Jasmine is probably a whole nother story. But essentially, I said, well, I really want to marry you. So when I'm 35, I will consider children, but you have to be the at-home dad. And so Dan has always loved children, and he's an early childhood teacher, so that's his passion. Is little children. So he agreed that if we did have children eventually, that he would stay at home, and he did that. So for the first 8 years of our kids' lives, he was the at-home dad, and that allowed me to focus on what I really wanted to do, which is give back to the community, and my drive for making a difference, that allowed me to do that. So I am actually really grateful, because without his support, I wouldn't be able to run the hospital.
Well, we'll go to another famous person in New Zealand, namely Jacinta Ardern, who's got a stay-at-home husband.
Yes.
And I often think as a woman that you couldn't... We feel a terrible amount of guilt, and I'm sure some men do too, but putting your kids in childcare or having someone else looking after them. But if it's their father, it's our only way of not feeling guilty, I suppose, that they're being brought up by someone other than us. So I want to talk about your career in a little bit, and where you've ended up and how you've ended up here in Toowoomba and the role that you're playing. So we were going back to you came to Australia, you loved it, you said the weather's good, I'm in my bikinis, I'm ready to stay here. So what happened after that?
So, when I chose to come to Australia, I didn't know where I wanted to be, but I thought, well, Brisbane seemed nice, but I'm not interested in a big city. So I got back and I said to Dan, what are we doing here in New Zealand? We really need to go to Australia. And he said, well, if you really want to. And it was really great, because the kids were at a point in our lives that just before starting high school was the perfect time for Jasmine to come over and things. And so I went on Seek and I Googled jobs, executive jobs, and it came up with one of Executive Director Population Health and Engagement, which was written for me. The job application was fantastic, and it was for an organisation called Medicare Local in Toowoomba, Darling Downs and Southwest Medicare Local. And so I thought, great. So I put my CV in, and the next day they called me and said, do you want to come for an interview? And I thought, this is too good to be true. I don't even know where Toowoomba is. So I Googled Toowoomba, and it came up with the 2011 floods. And this was in 2013. And that was all that there was on Google Pictures and everything. And Dan said to me, oh, no, we can't go somewhere that's like, it's obviously a horrible place to live. And then we read that it said it's a 1 in 100 year flood. And so I said to them on the phone, look, I'll come for an interview, but I'm going to come in person. And we came during Flower Festival time, and so we drove for like an hour in the middle of nowhere in our minds, because New Zealand's a lot smaller. And we drove up the range, and I couldn't believe it, this beautiful city on top of this mountain. And the flowers were amazing. And our town in Palmerston North is called the Rose Garden City. And so we were like, oh my gosh, it's like Palmerston North, so tick. And then we went to the information centre, and they showed us the USQ Japanese garden, and because we'd lived in Japan, it was another tick. And then we thought, this is amazing. And I started in that job, and 2 days into the job, my boss said, oh, by the way, the government's looking at closing Medicare locals across Australia, but I didn't want to tell you because we really wanted you and we knew you wouldn't come. And the problem was we'd sold everything in our house. We kept our house and rented it out, but we had sold all of our furniture, come over with 2 suitcases each, and then they tell me it's closing. And so that was in December of 2013. And then in May, the government did announce they were closing. But by that time, I'd gotten to know Dr. Peter Bristow, who was the Health Service Chief Executive of the Health Service. And I went and spoke to him and said, hey, I used to be operations manager at the hospital. Is there a job for me? And a couple of the other executives there sent me a couple of job adverts, and there was one that I ended up getting, and it turned out they changed the role name, etc., but I was a clinical redesign and innovation manager. And that was doing projects, which was fun. But about 6 months later, I said to Dan, we didn't come over to Australia to do projects. I left a great job, and what have we done? And we've family aren't around.
Did you have that sinking feeling where you thought, oh my God, I've taken us backwards. I've made this decision based on my career, and now we're not really that happy. I'm not really happy in this job. Did you have that feeling? Or did
100%.
Your ever optimistic self said, no, it'll be right, I'll create my own opportunities?
No, I felt really selfish for pulling Dan away from his family and his brother and sister, and I just felt really guilty because we'd kind of felt promised the world and everything had fallen over. And so we said, let's go back to New Zealand. So we were renting a house until we could find a place, and so we handed in our notice. We packed up the stuff that we'd accumulated in the time that we'd been here to send back on a boat. So we had the Jules boxes all packed up, ready for them to come and take. And then the executive director of the hospital, Dr. Peter Gillies, we went for a last trip to the Gold Coast, and on that trip, Peter Gillies called me on the phone and said, Shirley-Anne, we don't want you to go. Maybe we can work something out. How about you stay? And Dan, and I said no to Dan, no, we can't. No, we're going to go. And then we'd agreed that, and then I got an email from Dan at work on the Monday saying, Shirley-Anne, I know you really want to be here, so we can make it work. And it turns out that Peter Gillies became the Health Service Chief Executive and asked me if I wanted to be Executive Director of the Toowoomba Hospital, just in the interim until they advertised it. And I thought, oh yeah, that'll only be 3 months and someone else will get it. But 5 years later.
So this is my next question then, and certainly I don't understand, and there's probably lots of people who don't. Tell me about the structure of how the Darling Downs Health Service works. So you're an executive director, and Dr. Peter Gillies is the director?
Yes.
That's right. So tell me about the structure.
Yeah, sure. So the health service itself in Darling Downs is actually massive. We cover an area of 90,000 square kilometres, and we have around 21 hospitals, and then we have 6 aged care facilities and the 21 hospitals, and then you've got, including Toowoomba, which is the largest hospital, and we do about 65% of total activity. So my role is just Toowoomba Hospital, and then there's an executive director for rural, and we report up to Dr. Peter Gillies, who's the Health Service Chief Executive. And then there's some other executive directors for example, nursing and midwifery, medical services, allied health. But the operational managers are a mental health executive director, and then you've got the rural, which looks after the smaller large number of smaller hospitals, and then I look after Toowoomba.
Okay. So you mentioned it earlier when you were talking about the social determinants of health. So can you just flesh that out a bit for me? I know that's your real passion.
Yeah.
But what does it mean?
So the social determinants of health are things that happen to you that impact on your health, but actually have nothing to do with access to healthcare. So, for example, taking my parents, for example, being teenagers, my mum dropped out of school at 15. So when you drop out at school at 15 and you don't go on to get further education, your employment opportunities are limited. When your employment opportunities are limited, you'll earn less money, so you might earn minimum wage. And it means that, like with my family, they then rented a home, but to afford rent, you might have to go further out from a big city to afford rent. So you move to smaller towns, and in those smaller towns, you don't have as many opportunities, and your family, your kids don't have as many opportunities. So like for me, there was only one high school in our town of Fielding, so I had to go there. The other thing about that is you might not have access to a car, so you have to rely on a bus. All those things impact on how your health is, because if you don't live in a big city, you might not have access to a specialist if you get sick. And like my father has type 1 diabetes, he's had it his whole life, and so type 1 diabetes is hereditary, and he got that from his mother. And so health literacy is really important, and it's different to literacy, but often people in lower socioeconomic situations, they don't understand things as well. And so understanding your medication, you're more likely to have medication errors, and all of that impacts on everything.
So what can we do? How do we intervene then? How do you break that cycle? At what point in that cycle can you intervene and make some changes then?
Well, I reckon that one of the best quotes on the social determinants of health that I often use is Frederick Douglass said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." So by the time you look at adults, it's too late. We've got to start with the kids. And so when I look at things like domestic violence, it's really hard to educate perpetrators already, because often they're just repeating a cycle of violence. But if we can start with the children and educate them on a different way than what they've maybe grown up with, that's where we can break the cycle. But it's generational. It won't happen overnight.
So that brings me to my next question, which is a group that you're involved in, which is called Toowoomba Together. So can you explain that to me?
So I'm part of Toowoomba Together, which is a group that's run by John Minns. It's a charity group that exists to eliminate gender-based violence. And in New Zealand, I noticed that during an All Blacks game, when we lost the matches, the next day you'd hear in all the papers about the amazing amount of increase in domestic violence. And through my studies with social anthropology, I realised it's not just New Zealand with the domestic violence following a rugby game, but there's a massive amount of domestic violence following sporting events, like even in Australia, AFL or State of Origin. So State of Origin sees a 40% increase in domestic violence. And domestic violence in England following a soccer match is massive. And there's domestic violence even when they lose, because alcohol is often associated with sports events. And so people drink, their team lose, and then they go home and bash up their families. And that's part of that social determinants, because, again, the drinking leading to DV, if you grow up in a DV family, then often you become a perpetrator yourself. If you're a victim, you become the perpetrator. And it's through no fault of your own. You just don't know what you don't know, which is why it's really important we start with our kids.
So just going back to Toowoomba Together, so it's necessarily DV or it's other things that you do in the community? Tell me about that.
Yes, so although it exists to eliminate gender-based violence, that's not just domestic violence. So there are 5 pillars that have been set up, and the pillars are basically focus groups that have been identified that impact on domestic violence and that we can use as a way to make a difference. And so I lead a health pillar. And the reason I do the health pillar is because I'm involved in health, but there's a strong link between your health and domestic violence. For example, they know that early pregnancy loss is an impact from domestic violence, anxiety and depression. There's a sports pillar, and as I've said, sports really closely related with gender-based violence as well. There's a faith pillar, because we know porn is linked to DV. And the faith pillar, the reason I say porn with the faith pillar, it's more because Letitia Shelton is leading that, and Letitia has a passion for that field. And then we've got a business pillar, and it's because businesses are affected by employees being off sick through DV situations.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got one more,
which is escaping you at the moment.
Yeah, it is.
What it is. So, Shirley-Anne, we know that with the pandemic and people in lockdown, although I don't think in Queensland we have a true appreciation of locking down like they have in Melbourne and now in Sydney, of course. But the incidence of domestic violence ramping up, is that something that has been recognised? And
yes.
Yeah.
So during the pandemic, I set up a vulnerable communities group, and from there, a lot of the community groups talked about the fact that there was an increase they felt in domestic violence. And so I said, what's caused this through the COVID-19 pandemic? And they said because perpetrators are at home with victims, and victims in the past have been able to maybe get out of that situation by leaving their home. But unfortunately, because of the way the pandemic made people lock down in their own home, it meant that victims and perpetrators being put in a situation together, the victim couldn't call for help. And that made it really, really hard.
So, Shirley-Anne, can you tell me a little bit more about your Vulnerable Communities group and what that involved?
Yeah, sure. So the Vulnerable Communities group was set up because at the start of the pandemic, and everyone realised health would be the lead with COVID, but people didn't know what this pandemic was, what it was going to be about. And very early on, the Chief Health Officer came out and said basically 1 in 4 people have the chance of getting COVID, and it's coming, and it's going to be massive like we've never seen. And so I had a lot of community people ringing me and saying, I've heard that Toowoomba's got a whole heap of COVID cases. And I would say, well, actually, we haven't got anyone yet. Where are you hearing this? And the more and more that I got calls, the more I realised people just didn't know the truth, and they were starting to panic. And so I thought about all the people that had called me, and I thought what I need to do is get them all in the one room, say the one message, and say this is the source of truth. We have no cases. This is where we're at. And if we do have cases, don't panic. Which brings me to my favourite quote of the pandemic, which is by philosopher Lao Tzu. Leadership is your ability to hide your panic from others. And I wanted to be a great leader in the pandemic and think, if we're in this together, and don't worry. So I went online to Teams because I realised we couldn't meet in person. And I had 9 CEOs of different charity groups who had called me. And I told them the number of cases around Queensland, number of cases in Australia, and the fact we didn't have any in hospital, but if we did, how we were preparing for it. For example, we did a lot of increasing our ICU capacity, etc. And they were so happy, they then informed their friends who joined, and before I knew it, we'd created a fear of missing out. And it went from 9 to 14, and then it blew to over 40 people coming online to listen. And I did it 3 times a week at the start of the pandemic, and then moved to twice a week. And then as we realised the pandemic wasn't going to be as bad as we thought, moved to weekly. And we still continue to this day, and it's fortnightly now. But we always have the intro at the start of me talking about how many cases there are and any latest COVID news. Now it's moved to vaccinations. But the reason that group ended up being something incredibly different to what it set out to be was we realised that the community members didn't know each other. And so they would see a homeless person who had come to have nowhere to go in COVID, and they would talk about this person and realise it's the same person they were all seeing, one for food, one for homelessness, one for maybe medical advice. And they realised that, hey, we can help each other. And so Lifeline, for example, had some food vouchers. They were able to give Protea Place, the homeless women's support service, and then Protea Place were able to share some ideas with others, and it became more of a networking thing. And I feel it's really made a difference for our most vulnerable community. And we had translation services where Catholic Care would translate services for the health service in Kurdish Kurmanji via video, because that community of refugees that have come over couldn't speak English. And so they couldn't understand COVID restrictions because they don't actually have a written language. So it would have to be a video. And so all of those sort of things, and everyone helped each other.
Yeah. So at the moment, do you find you said that the news is starting to go about vaccination. So can I get you to comment on the latest news break that we are getting at the centre out at the Wellcamp Airport? And I think the worry of most people, particularly if you talk to anyone in community and read any social media, is what's going to happen if there's an outbreak. And I think if you could just clarify what would happen if there was an outbreak at the centre.
Well, I guess the great thing is, and I'm not a spokesperson for this at all, but from Toowoomba Hospital's perspective, last year we thought we were going to have COVID throughout the community, so we set up a dedicated COVID-19 ward. As time went on and we realised there was no pandemic coming, we stopped that ward and it's become just a normal medical ward that we cannot do without. So if anyone at the quarantine centre, they can't come to Toowoomba for that, and anyone with COVID goes straight to Brisbane. Mm-hmm. And so we are confident that in Toowoomba, if we have any cases, even right now, we would have them come to us confirmed, and then we put them in one of the COVID allocated hospitals within Queensland.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and they'd be taken away from here. So, and it is to be built, my understanding, on the Howard Springs model, where there hasn't been any outbreaks from the Howard Springs, because I believe that the hotels at the moment, that's where all the leaks have come from, and hotels weren't built for a pandemic, were they? But we're nearly getting to the end. But what I wanted to talk to you lastly was about your Citizen of the Year award this year.
Oh.
So this year, that little girl, that 8-year-old girl who wanted to go and make a difference, was rewarded for her making a difference, wasn't it? So tell me about your Citizen of the Year award for 2021.
That's probably one of my best highlights of my life, other than actually having children now, which I never thought I would. But my children, they're just amazing, and I would never change that part of my life ever. But the Citizen of the Year was such a lovely thing to get, because sometimes it's nice to be rewarded. You don't expect it. And what I've realised about Toowoomba is, even though I got that award, there are dozens of more deserving people that just are tirelessly working to make sure other people's lives are better, and they do it selflessly. So I've got a list of people I'm going to be writing down for next year's award, because we are such a lucky community. People are so driven to make a difference, and they don't do it to be rewarded. And you see the same people at the same events. Right. And that's the thing that I've realised, that I've really got a lot of respect for so many people who have had, lots of people have had hard lives, some harder than others, but you can have a hard life and not care about others, or you can think, or you can live a great life and not have suffered any adversity. But it's the ones that I meet that think, actually, I'm going to make someone's life better, because if we all live a good life, it's better for everyone in society. I'm not a fan of having the rich, super rich, and the super poor, poor. I think it would be great if everyone just had a really good standard of living and everyone was happy. I know that's idealistic, but if I can do my part to help someone, and I realise my skill set is more strategic, helping, for example, I'm on a number of community boards because I think I can offer them great strategic planning and do some of that sort of financy stuff, but also educate people on the social determinants and how we can have empathy for people, because if you're born into poverty, most people remain there because you don't know what you don't know. And if people were more aware of people's circumstances and the fact that they didn't bring poverty on themselves, or that they leave school because they didn't have anyone telling them to stay, education like that, I think, is the way we as a society can have a better understanding of people and therefore be more tolerant.
I love your philosophy, Shirley-Anne. And I think your humility is probably one of the characteristics that I love most about you. And I think you're an incredibly deserving recipient of that Australian of the Year.
Thanks.
Citizen of the Year? Citizen of the Year. No, I'm elevating you to Australian of the Year.
Yeah,
you could be Australian
I'm certainly not that great.
So, Shirley-Anne, it's been just a joy to speak to you this afternoon and to hear your pathway from your childhood in New Zealand to where you are now, and to think that your career is probably only halfway through. And, you know, I'd love to see you in another 5 years and see where you're up to then. You're probably the next Prime Minister of New Zealand, or Australia for that matter.
Thanks,
so thank
Megan.
you very much.
You.
Thank you. That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.